Welcome to the workshop. We want to continue taking a look at connectives, in particular implications or conditional statements. So we took a look at what a conditional statement is in our last video, and this time we actually want to go ahead and write out some conditional statements. So let's take a look at those examples. So we have 4 statements, and we want to take a look at 4 conditional statements as well. I'd like to begin by taking a look at the truth table for implications, or for conditional statements rather. So the truth table. The truth table, of course, involves P and Q, or the conditional statement does. So we want to consider all possible truth value combinations of P and Q. So we say true, true, false, false, true, false, true, false. That gives our 4 possible combinations. And then we want to consider P implies Q. For P implies Q, we said way back at the beginning of the of our last video when it's false. And we said it's false only when, let's see here, P is true, but Q is false. So with that rule that we described at the beginning of our last video, it would be false precisely at this instance and true at every other. So false at this particular combination of P and Q, and true at all of the others. Excellent. So let's go ahead and take a look at the truth value of each of these individual statements. Now, we'll take a look at this a bit more in the next section, but when we take 2 statements and we combine them, the result is what's called a compound statement. And the smaller statements that create the compound statements are called component statements. So you'll see things phrased like, let's see here, the conditional P implies Q is true exactly when the premise is true and the conclusion is false, and is true for all other combinations of the component statements. Okay, so you might see something like that. All right. Anyway, so let's take a look at our component statements here and determine whether they themselves are true or false. So it's the same collection that we've been taking a look at. So 5 plus 3 is equal to 15. Of course, that's false. April 24th, 2020 is a Friday. We said that is true. Some cows are brown. That is true. And chocolate milk comes from brown cows. Now, I'm going to say this is false, because I think you know what I mean. You don't milk a brown cow and get chocolate milk. That's what I'm trying to say. All right, so we want to consider the conditional statements. We have 4 of them to consider here. Q implies P. All right, so April 24th, right there, if-then statements. So if Q, then P. If April 24th, 2020 is a Friday, then 5 plus 3 is equal to 15. So the question is simply, do we have a situation where the premise is true and the conclusion is false? Is that the case? Yes, the premise is true, but the conclusion is false. And that gives us the one particular situation in which the conditional statement is false. So in this case, since the premise is true, but the conclusion is false, I'll say the implication is false. All right. So we just want to repeat this for several examples here. So R implies Q. So if some cows are brown, then, right, if R, then Q. If some cows are brown, then April 24th, 2020 is a Friday. Excellent. So essentially what we end up with, we can kind of break things down a little bit. When we're looking at an implication or a conditional statement and trying to decide if it's true or false, the first thing that we can do is take a look at the premise. If the premise is false, we automatically know that the implication is true, okay? Because we know that we don't have this situation. So if we find that the premise is true, then we move on and check the conclusion. If the conclusion is also true, then hey, we're happy, the implication is true, all right? If we find that the premise was true, but the conclusion is false, that's the one instance, again, where we have that the implication is false. So in this case, some cows are brown. Yes, that's true. April 24th, 2020 is a Friday. Yes, that's true. So since both the premise and the conclusion are true, the implication is true. Excellent. You'll also notice here that the premise and the conclusion don't have to have anything to do with one another. When we talk about proving something, we will be taking a look at implications or conditional statements, and we'll find that the premise and the conclusion are typically related to one another because that's what we usually see. But in its fundamental state, in its most basic definition, an implication or a conditional statement, the premise and conclusion don't have to have anything to do with one another, right? Because all we want to know whether it's true or false. In the section on writing proofs, of course, we want to prove that the implication is true. All right. So in our next in our next part here, S implies Q. So we have if chocolate milk comes from cows. Those don't need to be capitalized there. If chocolate milk comes from cows, then let's see, P was that 5 plus 3 is equal to 15. And of course, we still have, well, I don't really care that 5 plus 3 is equal to 15, but chocolate milk comes from cows is false. So that's the first thing I check, and that's the only thing I have to check since it's false. So since the premise is false, I don't care whether the conclusion is true or not, because when the premise is false, the implication is true. Done. That's it. All right, so finally, we find ourselves at P implies Q, which is, right, swapping P and Q from our first example. So here we have if 5 plus 3 is equal to 15, then April 24th, 2020 is a Friday. Excellent. And in this case, I don't care one bit about the conclusion yet, right? I always start by checking the premise. Is the premise true or false? The premise is false here. Since the premise is false, the implication is true. So since the premise is false, the implication is true. And that's it, right? Once we know the premise is false, we can say that the implication is true, and we move on. All right? There's no reason to check both. Only when the premise is true do we have to bother with checking the conclusion. And when the conclusion is true, the implication is true. When the conclusion is false, the implication is false, right? So when the premise is true, the value of the implication depends on the conclusion, right? It takes the value of the conclusion. When the premise is false, the implication is true. All right, there's a bunch of ways to say it, so hopefully you can follow along with one of those several ways that we've talked about it to determine when a conditional statement is true or false. But that's all that I wanted to share for this video, so I'll see you guys back in the workshop very shortly.